A young man impregnates a 60-year-old widow, but is left devastated when she discovers that he was the one who caused the accident that killed her son 10 years ago. The story I want to tell you today is not simply a forbidden love. It is a journey of redemption, of unspeakable pain, and of a love that blossoms in a place no one thought it could exist. Stay until the end, because I believe that whether you have loved, lost, or forgiven, you will find a part of yourself in this story. Number 23 on that little street. Eleanor lived there alone. A woman of 60, her hair streaked with salt, her figure no longer slender, but her every movement slow and sure, as if she had never forgotten anything in her life. People in the neighborhood called her Widow Eleanor, not unkindly, just a fact that had been known for so long that no one questioned it anymore. Eleanor watered the plants every morning with an old metal pitcher. When she wasn't gardening, she sat by the living room window, a book in her hand, but her eyes often stopped at the window across the hall, room 5. That room had been locked for 10 years, ever since Matthew, her son, never returned. Julian moved in on a Saturday morning. His car was parked in front of the house next door, the house that belonged to Eleanor's cousin Linda. The young man was thin, carrying a heavy backpack. His head bowed slightly when talking to strangers. Bright brown eyes, slightly curly hair, the kind of hair only young people wear so carefreely. Eleanor glanced out the window as Julian bowed to Linda and began moving his things. He walked across her yard, caught a glimpse of the woman cutting lavender without saying anything. Eleanor didn't smile either. She wasn't cold, but since Matthew died, she hadn't opened her heart to anyone for more than 3 sentences. And Julian was just a new neighbor, nothing more. But strangers sometimes find each other in the smallest things. It was a cool afternoon, the sun slanting through the branches. Julian, after rummaging through the living room, discovered that Linda had no books, except a few on knitting. He remembered Eleanor holding the books the first day they met, so he took a chance and knocked. Eleanor opened the door with her gardening gloves, still covered in dirt. "What do you need?" she asked. "Neither cold nor warm." Julian scratched his head. "Oh, I'm so natural, but I just moved in and I don't have anything to read. Can I borrow a book from you?" Eleanor looked at Julian. His eyes didn't waver. There was something waiting for permission. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, turning and walking into the house without saying anything more. Behind her, Julian let out a sigh of relief. In the living room, Eleanor took an old Steinbeck novel from the bookshelf. The cover was worn with pencil marks in some passages. She turned and handed the book to Julian. "It's sad," she said. Julian chuckled. "I don't mind being sad, as long as it's true." Eleanor was taken aback, not by the answer, but by the voice. Deep, slow, and carrying a very old sadness, just like Matthew had, just a little but enough to make her turn away to hide her gaze. From that day on, Julian passed by Eleanor's house more often, sometimes to return a book, sometimes to borrow a pair of scissors, and one day, for no reason at all, he brought over 2 cookies and said, "I made some extra." Eleanor never asked him why, but strangely enough, she didn't mind. One time after Julian left, she stood by the window looking out for a long time. She couldn't remember the last time she had a visitor, and why this time his presence didn't make her feel defensive. Maybe because he didn't try to come in, just stood there waiting for a door to open, if she wanted it to. Room number 5 was still closed. But when she walked past the hallway each night, Eleanor no longer looked at it with the eyes of a mother who had lost a child. She looked at it with the eyes of a woman trying to remember what it felt like to have someone call her name in a truly gentle voice. At the foot of the stairs, Julian walked across the garden. He looked up at the second-floor window, where the light was soft, and he wondered, what was the woman reading? And did she know that every time she opened the door, something inside him was soothed, something he couldn't name but had not rested for 10 years? Eleanor was not a fan of chamomile tea. She preferred something stronger, Earl Grey, sometimes Darjeeling. But since Julian started coming over more often, she had been making chamomile tea. Perhaps it was the only tea he drank without wincing. Or perhaps it was just for quiet afternoons where a story didn't need a conclusion, just someone to listen. That day, Julian returned east of Eden. He knocked 3 times, then waited. The door opened slowly. Eleanor was wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. She glanced down at the book, then at Julian. "Finished." Julian nodded, his voice low. "It's sad, like you said, but good. Good pain." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, not smiling, just saying, "Come in. Fresh tea." For some reason, Julian followed the invitation as easily as if he had always been used to it. For some reason, Julian followed the invitation as if he had always been used to it. Eleanor's kitchen was not large, but it was clean and smelled faintly of old wood and sun-dried orange peels. He sat down in a chair across from the dining table. On the table were 2 cups of tea, a small pot of honey, and a plate of gingerbread cookies. "You're baking?" Julian asked. Eleanor shook her head. "Bye, but winter's coming. Maybe I will." She pushed the cup toward him. "More honey." Julian nodded. "Just a spoonful." She spooned the honey into his tea, as gently as if she had been doing it for the same person for 10 years. Then they fell silent. It wasn't awkward. It was as if the conversation were fermenting in the air. "Have you lived here long?" Julian asked, after a few sips of tea. 34 years. Eleanor said, her eyes still on the maple trees outside the window. "Moved here after I married Thomas. Then Matthew was born here." The name made the air pause for half a second. Julian didn't ask any more. He just nodded, as if remembering something important. "And you?" Eleanor turned. "Why are you here?" Julian pursed his lips, then exhaled. "I need a quiet place. Linda said I could stay here for a few months. I'm going back to school." "Writing." "Writing?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "It's not easy." "No," Julian smiled. "But it's necessary. There are things that can't be said, only written." Eleanor nodded. It was a deep, sympathetic nod that made Julian feel, strangely, relieved. "Matthew writes too?" Julian asked after a moment. Eleanor paused, then nodded. "He's not very good, but he writes everything, diaries, poems, silly song lyrics." Julian chuckled. "I write lyrics too, but no one has ever heard them." "Then I'm better than him." Eleanor turned to look at him, her eyes unguarded for the first time. She said, "Writing for yourself is enough." Silence fell again, but this time there was something softer. Not hesitation, but understanding. Julian's tea was half empty. He sniffed at it. The chamomile scent was still warm. He looked up. "Can I come back? I mean, not just to borrow the book." Eleanor didn't answer right away. She put her chin on her hand, looking straight at Julian, the eyes of a woman who had lived long enough to know when to believe. "Are you telling the truth?" Julian didn't blink. "I've never seen anyone like you, and I think I need to learn to sit still like you're doing." Eleanor nodded, then smiled a very small smile, like dropping a stone into a still pond. "Okay then." That evening, Eleanor washed 2 teacups in the warm water. She could smell the lingering scent of chamomile on her hands. A faint scent, but hard to fade. She looked at the window that had once belonged to her son. It had been a long time since she had felt time slow down for someone else. On the other side of the fence, Julian did not go to bed early either. He opened a small notebook and for the first time in years wrote a sentence without remorse. "She smelled of chamomile tea, and her silence made me want to sit there forever and never leave." Eleanor never locked the living room window, but room number 5 upstairs was different. That white wooden door with its old brass knob had been locked from the inside for 10 years. She had not cleaned it, had not wiped it, had not let anyone in. Every time she passed, Eleanor would glance briefly, then walk away as if her eyes had encountered a memory that was not to be relived. No one was allowed in that room, because it was where Matthew had grown up, and where she had believed she could stop time. It was a chilly afternoon. Julian arrived earlier than usual, holding a paper bag containing 2 loaves of grilled cheese. Linda had said Eleanor had replanted the basil beds, and he thought hot bread might be good for such a damp afternoon. Eleanor smiled faintly as she opened the door. She looked at the paper bag, and then at Julian. "Has anyone ever told you that you were a bit of an old-fashioned person?" she asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. Julian shrugged and said softly, Yes, you're the second. Eleanor tilted her head, a mischievous glint in her eye. Who was the first, she added. You. Julian chuckled, handing her the bag of cookies. They sat on the back porch, where a round, sun-bleached wooden table was surrounded by terracotta pots of rosemary and lavender. Eleanor poured tea, Darjeeling this time, stronger, matching the chill that crept through the wind. Julian took the cup in his hand, took a sip, and asked, "How many bedrooms do you have?" 4, Eleanor said, looking out into the garden. 3 for guests, 1 for me. And the one upstairs to the left of the stair. Dick, what was that? Julian asked again, his voice light as a breeze. Eleanor paused, not at the question, but at Julian's tone, not on purpose, but enough to stir the memory. That house was my son's. She spoke slowly, as if drawing the words out of her throat. Julian bowed his head, his voice low. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to trespass. Eleanor shook her head, still looking toward the end of the garden. It's not my fault. Everyone was curious. But no one asked. I asked? That means I was braver than them. The words startled Julian a little. He fell silent, then nodded slightly, as if to remember something important. Eleanor put down her teacup, her voice lower. Matthew died in an accident. On his way home from school. A boy was driving, only 12, stealing his parents' car. Julian looked up. His lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. Eleanor still didn't look at him. She continued, as if reciting a memory that had been pressed tightly against her chest for too long. He wasn't in jail. The police said it was an accident. His mother came to apologize. I don't remember her face, only her voice, so soft, like she was afraid of herself. She let out a long breath, then continued. I don't forgive. I don't hate. It's just, I don't know what to do with the rest of me after that. Julian squeezed his hand lightly around his teacup. His heart pounded, each beat a wave of memories he had tried to bury for years. That room number 5, Julian had imagined it to be empty. But now he saw a whole universe left behind the door. A universe that had once been called Matthew. A child Julian had never known, but had taken away. He swallowed, then asked softly, You've had that room since then. Eleanor nodded, her eyes still fixed on the fence at the end of the yard. Never opened it again. Someone told me to pack up and move out, but I don't want anyone else to live there. I don't want anyone else to breathe in that room. A pause. Julian looked up and asked softly, Have you ever seen that room waiting for you? Eleanor turned to look at him. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not angry, not hurt, but as if hearing something familiar from afar. When Julian left Eleanor's house that day, he said nothing more. He just bowed and walked slowly down the gravel path. Room number 5 wasn't open, but it seemed the window on the second floor was swaying slightly in the wind, a movement so small that no one was sure it was real. Eleanor stood behind the curtain, holding a cup of cold tea. She watched Julian disappear behind the fence, then turned. For the first time in years, she walked up the stairs at a slow but steady pace. In front of room number 5, she stopped, her hand on the doorknob. The key was still in her skirt pocket, where it had been for a decade. She didn't open it, just stood there, as if waiting for a beat or a breath to know. It was time. Some changes don't come from big actions. They begin with a longer than usual glance, an unbroken silence, or a touch so light, so long remembered by both of them. That afternoon, the wind picked up. The clouds rolled in on the horizon, not threatening, just silent. Julian arrived as Eleanor was washing the living room windows. She wasn't wearing her usual dress, but a pair of gray slacks and a loose white shirt. You're early, Eleanor said, as she opened the door. Her tone wasn't reproachful, just acknowledging. I wanted to help you in the garden, if you needed it. Julian smiled, reaching for a pair of pruning shears and gloves. Linda said it would rain tomorrow. Eleanor tilted her head, pursed her lips. I don't need help. But then she opened the door wider. But since you're here, come in. In the kitchen, Eleanor put on the kettle. Julian wiped his muddy boots and stood looking at the small photograph hanging on the wall. A black and white portrait of Matthew at age 10. His gaze lingered longer than necessary. Eleanor emerged from the kitchen, holding a teapot. It's the only one I haven't put away, she said, placing the pot on the table. Julian turned hesitant. I didn't mean to look at it for so long. "It's okay," Eleanor interrupted, her eyes softening. "Someone once said, don't hide pictures of people you love. They'll think you've forgotten them." Julian nodded, then sat down across from her. Today's tea didn't contain chamomile. Eleanor had brewed a slightly bitter herbal version. Julian grimaced as he tasted it. "Not good?" Eleanor asked teasingly. "No? I'm just not used to it," Julian laughed. "But it has an aftertaste. Stronger than chamomile." "Like me?" Eleanor said, a rare glint of mischief in her eyes. Julian looked at her, a little taken aback. For the first time he saw Eleanor not as a mother who had lost a child, but as a woman. A woman of experience, a mixture of peace and coldness. "You're beautiful," Julian blurted, then seemed to realize what he had said. "I mean, the temperament." Eleanor didn't smile. She just tilted her head, her eyes softening slightly. "I was beautiful, in a different way. Now I'm just left with what people don't care about." "But that's why," Julian said, his voice lower. "It's unforgettable." After tea, Julian helped Eleanor put away the potted plants on the porch when the wind picked up. As he stacked the bags of soil by the door, his hand accidentally brushed Eleanor's, dusty but strangely warm. Eleanor withdrew her hand a little too quickly. "Sorry," Julian mumbled, taking a step back. "I didn't mean to." Eleanor nodded, turning away. But there was something in her eyes that was not quite angry, not quite confused. The sky darkened more quickly than expected. Eleanor handed Julian a handkerchief. He took it, wiped it, and held it a little longer. "The tea is bitter today," Julian said, trying to lighten the mood. Eleanor looked up and said slowly, "Sometimes you have to drink the wrong thing to know what you're used to." Julian pursed his lips. Then he asked, not looking directly, "Do you feel things are changing?" Eleanor was silent for a moment, then said slowly, "Yes, but I'm not sure how much." At that moment, the wind from the porch blew in through the crack in the door. The scent of lavender basil and something of the coming rain drifted into the kitchen. Julian stood up. "I'll be back before it rains." Eleanor didn't stop him. She just walked him to the door, holding the doorframe by reflex. As Julian stepped out into the yard, she called softly, "Julian." He turned, his eyes expectant. Eleanor said nothing. She just reached up and brushed a stray strand of hair from his forehead. It wasn't a long touch, but it was long enough for his heart to skip a beat. That night, Eleanor lay alone in her bedroom. She opened the window, something she rarely did at night. It hadn't rained yet, but she smelled damp earth and something in there. A breath, a warm void. She put her hand to her chest. Her heart was still beating steady and slow, but she knew something inside her had moved. Slightly, very slightly. The night in the small town was so quiet that sometimes Julian could hear the clock in Aunt Linda's living room, even though the door was closed. Time did not pass, but stood still every minute, every second, forcing him to live with things he did not want to face. And one of them was Eleanor. Since that afternoon when she touched his forehead, so lightly, so gently, Julian could not sleep well. At first, he thought it was just a passing emotion, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her gaze. Her eyes were no longer sad, as when she talked about Matthew, but they were not completely peaceful either. They were like winter windows closed, but still letting in the wind, cold and soft at the same time. Julian rolled over. The clock read 2:11 a.m. He got up, took his sketchbook from the drawer, opened the first blank page, and began to draw. Not Eleanor's whole face, he did not dare, but he drew her wrists, the veins showing through the thin skin, the tilt of her shoulders as she poured tea, and the silver hair that tossed lightly across her forehead. Julian was no painter, but each stroke had a weight to it, as if he were trying to hold on to something that was slipping away too quickly. He wrote in the margin, "She is not beautiful like a picture. She is beautiful like a memory I have never lived, but still remember." The next morning, Julian went out into the garden early. He mowed the lawn, watered the plants, and looked toward Eleanor's house. The curtains were still closed, but he knew she was up, because that was the time Eleanor usually made tea. Her footsteps were as light as falling leaves, but he could feel them every time. Julian went back into the house. In his hand was the drawing, the pencil still unshaded. He had no intention of giving it to her, at least, not yet. That afternoon, Eleanor was cutting back the lavender pots on the porch. Julian approached, holding a small bag. "Do you have aloe vera?" he asked, his voice calm. Eleanor looked up. "Yes, but I think mine is dying." Julian held out the bag. "I brought organic fertilizer, the kind I made with banana peels and coffee grounds." Eleanor laughed softly, a laugh that seemed unintentional, but carried something very human. "You're the first neighbor to bring me fertilizer." Julian smiled, standing closer. "Can I repot that pot for you?" "Okay." Eleanor nodded, then turned and led him toward the porch. "But only if you do it carefully." "I'm always careful," Julian said, bending down his hands, digging into the soil, his heart still pounding. While Julian changed the soil, Eleanor sat beside him, wiping the gardening tools. She watched him quietly. Julian's movements were patient, like he was afraid of hurting something in the slightest way. "Do you stay up late?" Eleanor asked, as if it were an accidental conversation starter. Julian looked up and nodded. "Lately, yes. Not exactly insomnia, but not wanting to sleep." "Why?" she asked again, her voice light as a breeze. Julian looked at his palms where the dirt was still on them. "Because I'm afraid that if I close my eyes, I'll forget some little details that I don't dare think about during the day." Eleanor was silent for a moment. Then she said slowly, "I understand." Just 2 words, but Julian felt his heart soften, as if he had been forgiven without having to confess. When it got dark, Eleanor poured tea and invited Julian to stay for a snack. She brought out 2 slices of toast, spread with butter and honey. Julian sat across the table, the yellow light casting a shadow over her skin, a painting painted by time. "I used to paint you," Julian blurted, and then paused. "I'm sorry. Not all of it. Just parts. Arms, shoulders." Eleanor put down her teacup, looking straight at him. "Why?" Julian bowed his head. "Because I can't bear to look at you for too long, but I don't want to forget." A silence passed between them. Eleanor smiled softly. "I've never been drawn by anyone, not since I got older." Julian looked up, his eyes deep and sincere. "I didn't draw you because you were old or young. I drew you because I thought if one day you disappeared, I wouldn't forgive myself for not keeping something real." Eleanor didn't answer, but she poured more tea, her hands shaking slightly, just a little enough for Julian to notice. Whoa, that night when Julian came home, Eleanor stood in front of the mirror for a long time. She took off her coat, smoothed her hair, then unbuttoned her shirt, 1, 2, until she could see her neck. Her skin was wrinkled, blotchy, but in her own gaze, she did not see an old man. She saw a man still being looked at with eyes that slowed down time. At the same time, Julian lay in bed, his notebook still open. He added below the drawing, "I have never loved anyone like this, not with lust, but with fear of loss." And that fear was so sweet it hurt. Eleanor stood in front of her bedroom mirror, her hands toying with the collar of her worn sweater. She didn't choose her clothes for their looks, but for the feeling of wanting to be seen, really seen, after years of wearing them to disappear into empty spaces. Lately, Julian's eyes had made her feel alive, not as a mother or an old woman, but as a woman who could still be desired. That afternoon, Julian arrived later than usual. In his hands was a small pot of flowers, pale lavender, newly planted. "I think it leans toward the light," he said. "Like you." Eleanor raised her eyebrows, setting her teacup down on the table. "Like me." Julian nodded, his lips pursed in a smile. "No matter how much you're surrounded by, you still lean toward the light." Eleanor didn't answer, but she turned away so he wouldn't see the slight curve of her lips. They didn't go out into the garden that afternoon. It was chilly, and Eleanor suggested staying inside. Julian sat mending a cracked pot. Eleanor washed the cups, glancing over his shoulder from time to time. "What do you do when no one's around?" Julian asked, still absorbed in his work. Eleanor thought about it, then said, "I write letters that I don't send. I listen to old music. I read diaries from 10 years ago." Julian looked up, his eyes deep. The letters. To whom? To Matthew, to Thomas, and lately, to myself. "Can I read one?" Julian asked quietly. Eleanor paused. She wiped her hands, then pulled an old envelope from a drawer. Just one, and no questions after that. Julian took it carefully. The note was short-handwritten in a steady hand. It's cold today. Colder than that year. I look out into the yard and wonder if you were still alive, would you have gone to school as far away as you wanted? Would you still come home every weekend demanding pies and listening to me nag? I hate the silence of this house, but I'm also afraid that if it had a different sound, I wouldn't be able to imagine your voice anymore. Julian finished reading, folded the letter, his hands shaking slightly. He looked up at Eleanor. You carry so much in your heart. Eleanor turned away, her voice low. And what do you carry in your heart, Julian? Julian hesitated. Then he said, a mistake I never dared to look at. But now, I'm starting to not want to hide it anymore. As Eleanor washed her hands at the sink, Julian stood behind her, close enough to smell the tea, the soap, and something that was Eleanor. He reached for the towel, accidentally brushing the back of her hand. Eleanor withdrew her hand, not out of annoyance, but out of fear that she might not be able to pull it back next time. Julian took a step back, his voice soft. I'm sorry. Eleanor did not turn around. She said, you remind me that I still have flesh. A simple sentence, but it made Julian stand still for a long time. That evening, they sat drinking tea on the porch. Eleanor wore a thick robe, Julian a sweater. The wind blew through the crack in the door, but it did not make the air colder than the silence between them. Have you ever loved anyone? Eleanor asked, looking straight out into the garden. Yes, Julian answered truthfully, but never like this. Like what she turned back. Love, without knowing why, without a logical reason, without a clear future, but unable to let go. Julian replied, his eyes not avoiding. Eleanor smiled sadly. Then you know how I feel. Are you in love? Julian asked softly. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes unguarded. I don't know, but I miss you when you're not here. I hear the wind and wonder if you've brought a towel. I make tea, and I know I won't drink it without you sitting with me. Julian said nothing. He just reached out, touched her hand lightly. This time, she didn't pull away. Oh, as Julian left, Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching. Her hand still felt his, but deep inside her was a strange wave, not passion, but something inexplicable. She didn't know if it was love or replacement or part of the longing to live again. Only that it was growing every day. There are things that once they happen, can never be undone. Like the first touch, like a kiss that goes beyond convention, like that night when two people on opposite sides of age, past and loss, found each other in silence. Eleanor's house that night was quieter than usual. It wasn't raining, but the wind blew hard through the wooden fence, creating sounds like the sighs of the past. Julian was late. He stood at the door for a long time before daring to knock. Eleanor opened the door, not wearing a dress as usual, but a long sweater that reached down to her thighs, her hair loose. The light from the kitchen lamp made her look gentler than on a misty afternoon. I thought you were asleep, Julian said, his voice hoarse. I made tea and couldn't sleep, Eleanor replied, stepping aside to let him in. They sat at the kitchen table as usual, but today there was no cake, no jokes. There were only 2 cups of hot tea, and their eyes silently searching for each other and then avoiding each other. Julian squeezed the teacup. Do you think this is going too far? Eleanor did not answer right away. She watched the steam rising from the cup, then said, I don't know what far is anymore, because I haven't gone anywhere in a long time. I don't want to hurt you, Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. But I can't back away either. Eleanor looked up. Do you think I'm not afraid? I don't know which makes me feel weaker, the loneliness, or the fact that I still want to. I didn't come here because I was lonely, Julian said honestly. I came because I didn't know where else I could be real. Silence. But this time, it was a different silence, the silence of things quietly approaching. Eleanor stood up first. I'll get you an extra blanket. It's colder outside. She walked up the stairs, and Julian stood up instinctively. But then he stopped halfway down the stairs, hearing Eleanor's footsteps 1 step at a time. Slowly, but without hesitation. Miss Julian called softly. Eleanor stopped on the landing, looking back at him, saying nothing. He walked up a few steps, standing opposite her. There were only 2 breaths between them. I don't want to just dream about you anymore, Julian whispered. Eleanor didn't answer, but she reached out, touching his cheek lightly, a touch that needed no reason. Eleanor's room smelled of cinnamon tea and dried flowers. Soft yellow light fell on the wall with old black and white photographs. Eleanor sat by the bed. Julian stood in the doorway. "Are you sure?" he asked. Eleanor answered by standing up, walking closer to him, and placing her hand on his chest, where his heart was beating wildly. "You're not the first person I've loved," she whispered, "but you're the first person who makes me feel still a woman." Julian leaned down, pressing his lips to her forehead. A slow kiss. Then his lips touched her cheek, her neck, her thin shoulder that smelled salty with time. Eleanor shivered slightly, not from the cold, but from a shell that was falling off her. They were in no hurry, not from burning desire, but from two old souls, reaching for each other with each careful caress. The sweater fell to the floor, the buttons undone, not out of technicality, but out of an undisguised desire to see each other. Eleanor whispered, "Don't look at me with pity." Julian answered with a hug from behind. Not pity, gratitude. "Why?" she asked, eyes closed. "Because you let me live, if only for one night." Eleanor turned, kissed him, an ageless kiss. As they lay side by side, neither of them made promises. But there was no need. Because in that moment, Eleanor knew she had crossed the line, not of morality, but of her own shell. Julian touched her hair gently. "Are you okay?" Eleanor nodded. "I'm not sure, but I wouldn't settle for anything else." That night, the wind still blew through the garden, and in the room where there had once been only the sound of the old fan, there were now two breaths, warm, slow, and full of taboos. That morning the sunlight filtered through the curtains, creating soft streaks of light, like breath. Eleanor lay on her side, her hair spread lightly on the pillow, her skin showing a few folds of time but looking more peaceful than ever. Julian woke first. He didn't move, just lay still, looking at the woman beside him, the one who had opened up a world he never thought he would reach. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel satisfied. There was only one thing, a heart-wrenching gratitude. When Eleanor stirred awake, her first glance fell on Julian's face. Warm, youthful, but also filled with something beyond his years. "Don't you ever sleep over?" Eleanor asked softly, her voice still tinged with exhaustion. Julian smiled. "This is the first time I haven't wanted to leave after waking up." Eleanor sat up, pulling the covers around her. The early morning light made her feel real. Unguarded. "I know last night. It might complicate things," Julian said, his voice sincere. "But if you feel regret—" "No," Eleanor interrupted, shaking her head slightly. I just don't know what to call this feeling." Julian nodded. Then, "Let's not call it. Let's just call it today." Eleanor took a shower. When she stood in front of the mirror, she saw not a 60-year-old widow, a childless woman, but a woman who had just been hugged for the first time in years, not out of pity, but because the other person genuinely wanted to be close to her. But inside, her two opposing emotions were entwined, like two vines. On one side was the feeling of being alive again. On the other side was guilt. She asked herself, who am I betraying Thomas, the husband I lost, or the image of my widowed mother who had been protected for a decade? Julian cleared the table and made more tea. The scent of cinnamon tea filled the room, warming the kitchen. He took out a pen and wrote a few lines in a small notebook. I dare not call this love, but if it is not, then why is my heart no longer empty when I touch that hand? Eleanor came down wearing a long gray dress, her hair loosely tied. She wore no makeup or perfume, but there was something different. Her eyes were no longer gloomy. Morning tea. Julian handed her the cup. No sugar, just like you. Eleanor smiled slightly. Are you trying to become a habit of mine? Julian replied, his eyes straight. I don't know. But if I could be a part of your rhythm, I would do it every day. In the days that followed, Eleanor and Julian did not mention that night again. But the way they looked at each other, the way Julian put his hand on her shoulder as they passed, or Eleanor touched his hand as she poured tea, it all seemed to continue a silent song. One afternoon, Eleanor was reading when Julian came in holding a small bag. What is it? She asked. Julian opened the bag. It was a bottle of massage oil. You said your shoulder hurt a few days ago. Let me try it. Eleanor hesitated, but then she turned away, sitting in a chair. Julian rubbed the oil on her shoulder, his hand rubbing gently. His hand was warm, moving slowly, not aggressive, not furtive, just quiet care. Where did you learn all this? Eleanor asked, her eyes closed. YouTube, Julian replied, smiling, and a little feeling. Feeling what she asked softly. Julian whispered, when you really care about someone, your hand knows what to do. That evening, Eleanor went out to the backyard to water the plants. The breeze was gentle, the lavender swaying. Julian stood by the window watching her. The sight made him feel he was living in a beautiful yet fragile world. One wrong word, and everything would disappear. Linda happened to be passing by. She stopped when she saw Julian standing in Eleanor's house at night. Her eyes watched quietly. Then she walked away, saying nothing. Night. Eleanor lay on her side, Julian lying close to her, his hand resting lightly on her waist. What are you thinking about? Julian asked, whispering in her ear. Eleanor was silent for a moment, then said, I was thinking about tomorrow. And thinking if I was worthy of a new tomorrow. Julian pulled her closer. You don't have to be worthy, you just have to let me stay. Eleanor turned her head, looking deep into his eyes. But if the day comes when you have to leave, let me be the first to know. Julian nodded, kissing her forehead. If that day comes, I promise I'll let you know. But today, I just want to be here, with you. That night, they didn't say another word, and Eleanor understood, not just physically for the first time, but for the first time, she allowed herself to need someone like a woman. There are mistakes that no one wants to correct, because there is something too human about that mistake. For Eleanor and Julian that night opened not a disaster, but a door. A door to a private space where they could be real, even if only in the darkness of secrecy. Julian came to Eleanor's house more often, but always late at night. He brought simple food, spaghetti, garlic, red bean stew. They ate together in the dim kitchen light, neither of them mentioning the other worlds out there. Did you cook this yourself? Eleanor asked, tasting the soup. I learned it from a video, but I imagined you were the one tasting it. Eleanor chuckled. And if I said it was salty? Julian shrugged. Then I'll sweeten it next time. Eleanor was silent for a moment. Perhaps the sweetest mistake of her life was letting her heart soften for someone so young. Another evening, they walked around the back garden. The moon was dim, the grass was cold, the scent of lavender lingered in the dew. Eleanor wore a thick coat, Julian a thin scarf. They walked side by side, not touching hands, until Eleanor suddenly missed a step. Julian reacted quickly, holding her waist. His hand touched Eleanor's body, so warm and natural that she didn't push him away. They stopped, standing close together in the darkness. Do you always walk alone at this hour? Julian asked softly. Not before, Eleanor replied, looking at the moon. I was afraid of the night, but since you came, the night seems less scary. Julian squeezed her hand gently. I don't want you to be afraid of anything anymore. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes no longer guarded, but with something very adult. Fear is necessary. It reminds you that you are alive. Eleanor's kitchen gradually became a miniature world where Julian was no longer a gardener, and Eleanor was no longer a widow. One afternoon, while cooking a simple omelet together, their hands accidentally touched on the handle of the pan. Eleanor pulled her hand away, then smiled slightly. Be careful, it burns. Julian did not pull his hand away. He looked at her calm. I think I burned myself, but it wasn't the pan. Eleanor tried to respond with an evasive answer, but then exhaled, bending over the plate of vegetables. You say things like that. You make me forget I was a mother. Julian smiled, but his eyes became serious. You never stopped being a mother, but you also have the right to be a woman. In those days, Eleanor lived like a slow dream. No highs, no explosions, but full of moments that made her feel like she was still breathing with her emotions, not just her lungs. Julian kept more of a diary. In his notebooks appeared lines like, She was like no one else who had ever walked through my life. She slowed everything down. like the whole world was waiting for her to come. I know I'm in love. Not the blind kind, but the sober kind, that I know. This is wrong, but I can't stop. One day, while reading on the sofa, Eleanor suddenly felt a little dizzy. She put the book down and closed her eyes. Julian, who was making tea in the kitchen, ran out. "What's wrong?" "I'm fine. Just a little tired. I guess I didn't get enough sleep last night." Julian helped her sit up straight, his concern evident. "Do you want to go to the doctor?" "No need, I'm used to it." Julian sat next to her, not forcing her. But his eyes stopped at her hand, which was shaking slightly. "Miss," he said softly, "if you're tired, don't hide it from me." Eleanor clasped her hands together, smiling weakly. "I'm used to hiding things. But now, maybe I should practice letting others know." That night, Eleanor stood alone in front of her bedroom mirror. She looked into her eyes. There were wrinkles, there was darkness, but there was also a new light that she couldn't name. "A mistake," she whispered to herself. Then she added softly, as if in confession, "Too sweet." Eleanor woke late that morning. Sunlight flooded the room, filtering through the curtains and onto the warm sheets. She reached out, touching the space beside her, where Julian had lain the night before, now only a slight indentation in the sheets. She closed her eyes for a moment, and in the hazy moment between waking and dreaming, an image flashed before her. Her husband Thomas, his back to the window, the sunlight hitting the back of his neck, creating a painfully familiar outline of light. Eleanor opened her eyes, sighed. "It's not him," she told herself. "Just a young man? But why does he look so much like him?" In the kitchen, Julian was busy making coffee. The smell of coffee mixed with the smell of baking bread created a warm, homely atmosphere, something Eleanor had lost years ago. When she entered, Julian turned, and Eleanor paused for a moment. The morning light fell on one side of his face, making those deep amber eyes look exactly like the way Thomas used to look when he waited for her to pour him another cup of tea every Sunday morning. "Are you okay?" Julian asked, his hand on her shoulder. Eleanor smiled slightly, but something inside her cracked. Just a little déjà vu. All that day, Eleanor seemed to be living in two worlds. As Julian led her around the garden, the tone of his voice as he told her stories, the way he reached for the pruning shears, the way he tilted his head as she spoke, all reminded her of Matthew, her only son. There was a moment when Julian turned his back and bent down to pick up a dry branch when Eleanor almost called out, "Matthew, my son." But she swallowed it back, leaving a void in her heart that swayed like the wind blowing through the walls of an old house. That evening, after Julian had left, Eleanor sat alone in the armchair in the study, leafing through the pages of her old diary. A page stopped at March 10 years ago, the last spring before the accident. The hastily written lines read, "Thomas always got up early to make coffee. Matt liked to add twice as much sugar. Breakfast was the only time of the day we sat together, as if nothing had ever happened, as if nothing had ever been argued or lost. I was afraid I would forget the way Thomas looked at me through the coffee fumes, and the way Matt bowed his head to avoid the morning sunlight, his hair tousled like his father's." Eleanor closed the diary, her hand shaking slightly. Julian was not Thomas, nor was Matthew. But why did her heart react? As if they were one. Once, when Julian hugged Eleanor from behind in the kitchen, she closed her eyes. The feeling her shoulder, her arms around her, his warm breath on her neck made memories surge back like a tide. "Thomas," she blurted. Julian jerked slightly. "What did you say?" he asked. Eleanor turned, trying to hide her embarrassment with a faint smile. "I made a mistake." Julian didn't ask any more. But Eleanor knew he had heard. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She went out onto the porch, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and looked out at the trees swaying in the moonlight. She muttered to herself, "I can't use him to fill the void, but I can't shake this feeling." And then, as if confessing to herself, "I'm in love, but I don't know who I'm in love with." One rainy afternoon, Julian arrived at Eleanor's house earlier than usual. He brought a small box of cookies and some old books he had found at a clearance bookstore. "Have you ever read Hemingway?" Julian asked, when Eleanor opened the door. "He writes about men so well. It's painful for a woman to read." Eleanor smiled, letting him in. Julian loved hearing her say things like that, both sharp and gently ironic. But today, his heart was not completely at peace. While Eleanor was making tea, Julian walked into the study to put the books on the shelf. He accidentally knocked over a thin file on the table. A piece of paper fell out, Matthew's death certificate. Julian bent down to pick it up, intending to put it back, but his eyes unconsciously glanced at the words at the bottom of the page. That word made him feel as if he had been struck by lightning. Victim died of traumatic brain injury traffic accident at Deer Hill intersection, March 17th, 10 years ago. Julian paused. His heart was pounding. March 17th, Deer Hill, accident. The words came back like an old nightmare from deep in his memory. He sat down in the chair, his hands shaking slightly. That was the day. Julian had caused an accident when he was just learning to drive, running away in panic. He had lived with that shadow for 10 years, not daring to face it. At that time, the accident was reported as a hit-and-run accident. Julian, then a teenager, had been kept from his family, and he himself had locked that memory away in the deepest compartment. But now he was sitting in the house of the mother who had lost her child in that accident, and he loved her. Julian walked out of the room, trying to keep his voice normal. "Do you have more files on Matthew?" Eleanor poured tea, surprised. "Why do you ask?" Julian looked at her, his eyes confused. "I just want to know more about him, because I feel he never left this place." Eleanor sat down slowly. "You're the first person to say that in years. People come, leave flowers, say a few empty words, and then leave. But Matthew is still here in every corner." Julian swallowed. He felt choked up, not just from the pain, but from the fear growing in his chest. That night, Eleanor went to bed early because of a headache. Julian sat alone on the porch, holding a piece of paper he had taken from the study. The words Deer Hill glowed red on the screen of his phone. He typed them into the search engine. A series of old newspaper articles appeared. Deer Hill fatal accident hit and run. Victim is senior 21. Julian clutched his phone. There was no doubt. It was an accident he had caused. Eleanor was the mother of the person he had taken away. Julian did not sleep all night. He watched Eleanor from afar. She lay peacefully in bed, her hair disheveled, her face defenseless. "How could you love me?" Julian whispered. "If you knew I was the reason you lost everything." He felt like he was living a story that could not be redeemed, but his heart could not stop loving Eleanor. The next morning, Eleanor made tea as usual. Julian approached, put his hand on hers. For the first time, his hand was cold as ice. "Do you ever think everything that happens in your life has a reason?" Julian asked, his voice choked. Eleanor looked at him surprised. "I used to believe that. Then I lost it after Matthew left. And now," Eleanor replied softly, "I don't know. But if everything has a reason, then surely you came to make me remember what love was." Julian turned away. He couldn't let her see his eyes moisten. The old piece of paper was still in Julian's phone, like a time bomb. And Eleanor still didn't know that her heart was in love with the one who had stolen her other heart. Julian wasn't himself. Eleanor could feel it in his eyes, in the way he touched her hand, as if he were afraid he'd leave a mark, and in the silences that stretched between them. "Have you been okay?" Eleanor asked, as they worked the garden. Her hand was on a wildflower, her eyes fixed on Julian. He paused, then forced a smile. "I'm just tired." "Are you tired, or are you hiding something?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft but sharp. Julian bowed his head. "I just have a lot on my mind." Eleanor didn't press him, but as he turned away, she watched with a growing sense that Julian was hiding something serious. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her study, looking at old frames. One was of Thomas, her dead husband. The other was of Matthew, her only son. The two most important men in her life were gone. And now the third, Julian, was fading like a shadow through a curtain. Eleanor gently placed her hand on Matthew's picture. "If I were alive, I would be his age right." Julian drove around all night. He stopped in front of the old hospital, where Matthew had been taken after the accident. He remembered clearly the dented car, the blood on the glass, the ambulance sirens, and the fear that choked the 17-year-old's lungs. He had been hidden, forgiven by the law, but not by his own conscience. "Eleanor, you'll hate me, but I can't lie forever," Julian whispered, his eyes red. The next morning, Eleanor found Julian back, sitting in the kitchen, his head in his hands. On the table was a cup of cold tea and the notebook he used to write in. "What's wrong? That you can't tell me?" Eleanor asked, sitting down. Julian looked up. His eyes were tired, wounded. "Do you believe in karma?" "What are you talking about?" Julian swallowed. If someone did something bad and didn't get caught and then accidentally entered the victim's life, do they have the right to love? Eleanor stiffened. "Who are you talking about?" "About me," Julian said, his voice choking. Eleanor stood up. "What did I do?" Julian didn't answer right away. He pulled out his phone and opened the photo of Matthew's death certificate. He set it on the table. Eleanor looked down. Her eyes lingered on the place and date. The room suddenly felt cold. "I was there," Julian said, each word cutting into his mouth. "Deer Hill, March 17th, 10 years ago." Eleanor took a step back. "I caused an accident," Julian continued, his voice cracking. "I was 17, panicked, ran away. My family covered it up." Eleanor raised her hand, shaking. "Stop!" Julian choked. "I didn't know it was your son I hit until I saw that note. And then I fell in love with you." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes no longer warm as Julian had known them. There was terror, betrayal, and utter pain in them. "Get out," Eleanor said, her voice like stone. "You." "Get out," she shouted, the first time Julian had heard Eleanor lose control. He stood up, stepped back, and ran. He didn't look back. The door slammed behind him, like a hammer on a budding relationship, now shattered beyond repair. Eleanor collapsed to the floor. No tears, just silent sobs. She clutched her chest as if something were breaking inside. Thomas, Matthew, now Julian, all the men in her life, gone, leaving her with an unfillable void. The house that had been her home, now a tomb of memories. Outside, the wind blew through the fence. And inside, a woman sat silently in the ruins of her heart. Linda always knew something was wrong. It wasn't that she was idle, or that she was a parasite. It was simply that Eleanor had changed, in a way that a widow who had lived next door for 10 years couldn't help but notice. Eleanor had been reserved, steady, and not out of step with her daily routine. But in recent months, she had become different. Some days, the light in her room would stay on until late at night. Some days Julian, the gardener, would leave Eleanor's house early in the morning, his hair disheveled and his shirt unbuttoned. Linda began to notice these little things. She didn't say anything, didn't ask, didn't sneer, but in her eyes the changes weren't accidental. The morning after Julian disappeared, Linda found Eleanor standing on the porch for a long time, doing nothing. Just standing there, her hands shaking slightly, like someone who had just lost something. Linda brought jam and cookies over, knocked gently on the door. "Eleanor, is everything okay?" Eleanor opened the door, her eyes red. "I'm fine, thank you." Linda handed over the bag of cookies. "It's just, I made extra. If you need anything, I'm right here." Eleanor nodded, closing the door. But Linda stood in front of the house for a moment, looking at the window where Julian had stood, laughed. "Something has happened," she thought, "and maybe I'll be the last to know." The house was back to its original state, silent and cold. Eleanor walked from room to room like a ghost. The kitchen still smelled of old tea, but no longer did she laugh softly when she accidentally spilled sugar. The study was still full of books, but no one sat beside her turning the pages and commenting on Hemingway or Fitzgerald. Julian was gone. Eleanor did not leave the house for 3 days. Linda knocked on the door every morning, but she did not open it. She sat by the window, looking out at the garden, which was becoming deserted because no one cared for it. The lavender pots were starting to fade, and the grass was growing on the path. Eleanor still made 2 cups of tea every morning. One was placed in front of her, the other opposite her, where Julian had sat, resting his chin on his hand and smiling as she talked about Matthew. Now the seat was empty. Eleanor tried to open Matthew's wardrobe. She had not done so since the funeral. The navy blue t-shirt, the faded sneakers, the ketchup-stained cap, all remained in the same place as if no time had passed. She touched each item lightly, and then suddenly burst into tears. Not because of the loss of her son. That pain was deeper than tears. She cried because she didn't understand why her heart had learned to love again and then had torn all hope away with its own hands. At night, Eleanor turned on the lights in all the rooms, not because she was afraid of the dark, but because she was afraid of the silence. The silence allowed her to hear her own voice, the sound she had tried to deny during Julian's days. Now, between the familiar walls, Eleanor heard it all, the sighs in her dreams, the sound of footsteps, slipping the subconscious call of Thomas's name, and Julian's name uttered like a curse. The house that had been a shelter, now a prison. Eleanor stood in the middle of the living room turning around. Every corner held a memory: the sofa, where Julian had read, the table, where they had their first dinner, the window where he had kissed her forehead. Everything was still there. Only one person was missing. That night, Eleanor lay in her room with the lights on. Light filtered through the curtains, creating streaks on the ceiling. She kept her eyes open and staring, as if she stared long enough, Julian would emerge from the light. But he didn't turn around, and Eleanor knew he wouldn't. One morning, Eleanor felt sick. It wasn't the watered-down coffee or the burnt toast. She had lived long enough that those things didn't bother her. But her stomach clenched, and when she got up from the table, her legs wobbled. It must be the veins, she told herself. It's just old age. But when the second bout hit her at noon, right in the middle of watering the plants, Eleanor began to feel uneasy. That night, she flipped through her old medical book. Her fingers skimmed through the pages of notes about blood pressure, blood sugar, bone supplements. But nothing explained her recent symptoms. Nausea, mild chest pain, dizziness. And her last period had been long gone. So she couldn't think about the thing that only young girls panic about: pregnancy. She couldn't. The next day, however, Eleanor quietly stopped by the little pharmacy down the street. "Do you want the morning or any time kind?" the clerk asked. Eleanor hesitated. "Which one is for people who are not young?" The woman behind the counter looked at her, said nothing, just silently wrapped a small box in a brown paper bag. Eleanor did not use it right away. She left the pregnancy test in the drawer of her dressing table, like a criminal hiding evidence. But every time she opened the drawer, her eyes fell on the instructions: read after 5 minutes. 2 lines, pregnant. She had never thought at her age she would have to read those words. By dawn on Wednesday, Eleanor could stand it no longer. She woke early, took a cold shower to wake herself up, and walked into the bathroom with shaking hands. When the test changed color, she turned away, not daring to look. She wiped her face, took a deep breath, then turned back to pick up the test. 2 lines. Not clear, but 2 lines. Eleanor sank to the floor. The tile floor was cold, but her heart was burning, as if it had just been ignited from within. She sat in the bathroom for almost an hour. No crying, no screaming, just emptiness. How could it be? At this age, when all functions seemed to be dormant, a life was awakened. She remembered Julian, his eyes, his voice, his arms around her on nights that seemed to be theirs alone. Now he was gone, and she bore the consequences of a forbidden love. Eleanor walked out into the garden. The grass was still wet with dew. The silence was like a bottomless well. She sat on a wooden chair, staring into the distance. Should she call Julian? Should she tell him? Or should this be buried forever, like all the other pains in life? In her hand, the pregnancy test was still there. 2 faint lines, but clear enough to make the whole world different. In the morning sun, Eleanor understood sometimes what makes people collapse is not the loss, but the hope that remains to survive. Eleanor did not leave the house for 3 days after the pregnancy test showed 2 lines. The test was still in the dresser drawer, wrapped in an old handkerchief, Matthew's last birthday present before he died. Something in Eleanor felt it was right to put the 2 together, as if 2 worlds past and present were quietly colliding. She sat for hours in her study, her eyes lingering on an old photograph of Thomas. What would he say if he were alive, she wondered. Could he forgive me for loving someone like Julian? The question was silent in her head like a song without words. No one could answer it, and it could not be stopped. On the fourth day, Eleanor went to the hospital. She told no one, no warning, just a small bag and her medical record. The old doctor with white hair recognized her. They had met for a heart checkup a few years ago. "What's worrying you this time?" he asked softly. Eleanor didn't answer right away. Then, in a near whisper, she said, "I think I might be pregnant." The room fell silent. The test went quickly. The results would be back in an hour. Eleanor sat in the white hallway, clutching her coat pocket, as if it would keep her from breaking down. It could be a mistake, she thought. It could be hormones, stress-induced confusion. But deep down, she knew the truth had been there that morning. The faint lines couldn't be a mistake. When the doctor came back with the results, he didn't need to say much. Eleanor looked into his eyes and knew there was no mistake. There was life. "You're doing great," he said. "It's rare but possible. We'll need to keep a closer eye on it, but—" Eleanor interrupted, her voice hoarse. "I need time to decide." She returned home as the sky began to darken. Sitting on a wooden chair on the porch, Eleanor saw the world as hazy as a mist. A being small, silent, was living inside her. No one knew. No one knew. And the only person who had a right to know Julian was gone. "He needs to know," she whispered. But if he did, would he come back or run away again? Eleanor remembered the first time Julian had hugged her from behind while she was chopping vegetables. His hands were shaking slightly, as if he had never touched anything so fragile. "He loves me," she thought to herself. But is that love enough to bear the responsibility of knowing the cruel truth? That night, Eleanor took out a pen and paper. The letter wasn't long, just a few simple sentences. "Julian, there's something I need to know. I'm carrying a piece of you inside me, and I don't know whether to keep it or bury it, the way I've buried every loss in my life. If you ever read this, please come see me, just once. Eleanor." She put the letter in an envelope unsealed, just left it there, on the table where they had breakfasted. Well, the next morning, Eleanor still hadn't sent it. She stood in the middle of the silent house, looking around. Every wall, every window, every seat Julian had sat on. They were all asking her the same question. Keep it or let it go. No one could answer for her. No one but herself. Eleanor held the white envelope in her hand all morning. The letter was brief, not harsh, not pleading, not blaming. There was only one message, that she was carrying the consequences of a love they both knew was wrong. "You have a right to know," she whispered, "but you also have a right to deny the truth." Linda came over as usual this time, bearing fresh muffins. "You look a little better," Linda said, setting the tray down on the table. Eleanor smiled slightly. "I'm trying to be better." They didn't talk about Julian. There was no need. His name had become a silent space between them. Everyone knew it, but no one mentioned it. Though, as Linda prepared to leave, Eleanor hesitated. Then she took the envelope from a drawer and handed it to her friend. "Linda, I have a small request, only if you're comfortable." Linda looked at the envelope. There was no address, just one line, "Julian." "Can you give it to me?" Eleanor said, avoiding her friend's eyes. Linda was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I'll try." Linda went out that afternoon. She had an old address for Julian where he had lived with his aunt when he first came to town. She put the envelope in her bag as if afraid someone would see it and guess what it said. She felt strange. Eleanor had never been one to send letters without an address. 3 days later, Eleanor stood by the window holding a cup of cold tea. It was raining lightly outside. It had been more than 72 hours since Linda had left with the letter, but there had been no reply, no sign of anyone returning. No text, no knock on the door, just silence. Eleanor began to wonder, has the letter arrived? Will he read it? Or was it forgotten, never opened? That night, she dreamed that she was standing at a bus stop, holding a sealed letter. Hundreds of people were passing by, none of them stopping. A young man in a gray shirt approached like Julian, but not. He took the letter, smiled, and then disappeared into the mist. Eleanor woke in the middle of the night. Her heart was pounding. A cold sweat was on her forehead. "Nobody took it," she muttered. You must have gone too far to come back." The next morning, Linda returned. "You gave it to him?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her cool. Linda nodded. "I left it where he was. Somebody said he moved, but I left it in the old mailbox. Maybe someone will." Eleanor pursed her lips. "Thank you." Linda looked at her friend for a long moment, then said softly, "Some letters don't need to be received. They just need to be sent." Eleanor turned back to the table, her hand resting on the empty space where the envelope had been. Whether Julian received it or not, the most important thing was, she had spoken. And now she had to go on living, with or without a reply. The doorbell rang on a quiet, rainy afternoon. Eleanor was lying on the sofa, her eyes half closed, her hand on her belly where life was growing. She was not waiting for anyone, nor expecting anyone. But the bell rang a second time, clear and sure. She stood up, her heart slowly pounding in her chest. When she opened the door, Eleanor paused. The man standing there was not Julian. He was middle-aged, wearing a gray raincoat, holding a small envelope. "Excuse me, are you Eleanor McAllister?" "Yes," Eleanor said slowly. "I am Charles Green. I used to be a friend of Thomas, your husband." They sat in the living room, neither of them touching their teacups. "It's been a long time since I've been back in town," Charles said, looking around as if to recollect his memory. "I heard about Matthew. Much later. My condolences." Eleanor nodded. It had been years, but Matthew's name still made her choke up. "I didn't come just to say goodbye," Charles continued. "I got a letter from Linda, your neighbor. She met me at a charity event. She mentioned Julian." Eleanor stiffened. "She said there was a young man who used to come to your house, much younger, and then disappeared." Eleanor didn't answer. She clasped her hands together. She was worried, said she was unusually sad, and if I had known the family, I might understand. Charles opened the envelope and took out a crumpled old newspaper. He pushed it toward Eleanor. She looked down. Her eyes stopped on the headline, "Traffic Accident at Deer Hill. Driver still at large." Beneath it were photographs of the scene. The car had dented the curb. Blood smeared across the grass. Eleanor didn't need to read any more. She'd known the details for 10 years. "There's something you don't know," Charles said, slowly. "Julian was my student in the volunteer driving class for minors." Eleanor looked up, her eyes puzzled. "He dropped out in the middle of the class. Not sure why. But a few weeks later, I heard about the accident, and I suspected. I didn't dare say anything. There was no proof." "Why are you telling me now?" Eleanor asked, her voice hoarse. "Because I thought he might have caused the accident." The room fell silent. The rain outside was heavier, pattering on the roof. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes unblinking. "You know I loved him?" she asked softly. Charles nodded. "I guess, and I think I should tell you. Because if I kept quiet, you would never know. And he, if he really loved you, would have told you first." Eleanor stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at the rain-soaked garden. The lavender was bowed, as if bowing to something that was coming. "I knew," she said. Charles was silent. He confessed, and then he left. He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry if it's reopening old wounds, but I think you deserve the rest of the truth." Eleanor turned, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you. But right now, what I need most is not the truth. It's courage." Charles left shortly after. The house fell silent again. Eleanor sat down, her hands on her stomach. The little life inside her knew nothing of the past, didn't care who was right or wrong. She closed her eyes. A question rang out clear in her mind. Can love survive after the truth? The rain had just stopped when Julian returned. Eleanor was standing in the kitchen, making soup, when the knock came. She didn't turn. She just stood there, her hands gripping the handle of her spoon, as if she stood there long enough, the person outside would disappear. But the knock came again, slower this time, more patient. A knock that wasn't begging to be let in, but asking for forgiveness. She went out, opened the door, and there stood Julian, wet coat, red eyes, empty hands. "You," he began, but he didn't know what to say. "Come in," Eleanor said. Her voice was tired but not cold. Julian stood in the middle of the living room where everything was exactly as he had left it. Even the tablecloth still had the faint stain of coffee he had spilled. Only one thing had changed. Eleanor was no longer the woman in love. She was the one carrying a life and a pain. "I got a letter," Julian said softly. "Linda, hand it to me." Eleanor sat down, her hand resting lightly on her belly. "Did you come for the letter or for the baby?" Julian paused. "Both." "I thought you wouldn't come back," Eleanor said, her voice even. "I tried to accept it, but every morning when I touched my belly, I felt you. And I knew whether you came back or not, a part of you would live inside me forever." Julian took a step toward her, but stopped. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For everything. For not telling me sooner. For letting me love you when I didn't deserve it. And for taking the person you loved most and then walking back into your life, as if nothing had happened." Eleanor was silent. Then she asked very quietly, "If you could go back to that day, Deer Hill 10 years ago, would you stop?" Julian bowed his head. Lips quivered slightly. "I don't know. But right now, if I could trade my life for Matthew's, I would." The room fell into a silence that was no longer an empty space, but a place for grief to settle. "I don't need your sacrifice," Eleanor said. "I just need the truth. And today you brought it." Julian took a step forward. "Do you forgive?" Eleanor looked at him a long time. "No," she said, "I don't forgive, but I understand." That answer, strangely enough, brought tears to Julian's eyes. He bowed his head, his hand clasping hers for the first time, not out of love, but out of remorse. Eleanor didn't pull away. She let him cling like a drowning man, clinging to the last piece of plank. "The baby," Julian whispered. "You're going to keep it." Eleanor nodded. "I didn't think I'd ever get another chance to be a mother." Julian smiled through his tears. "So, can you stay, not to be my lover, but to be the father of this child?" Eleanor looked at him. Her heart broke again, this time not from pain, but from life rising from the ashes. "It's too early to decide," she said, "but you did the right thing. Come back." Outside, the sun was beginning to peek through the gray clouds. Inside, there were no promises, just a belated confession, and the heart slowly opening again. Eleanor didn't say much for the next month, but she watched Julian as if learning him all over again. He no longer entered the house like a lover, but like a man learning to be a father, step by step tidying the garden, changing the curtains, fixing the old hinges in the bathroom. Each little thing Julian did with silence and patience, like an unspoken apology. One afternoon, Eleanor was knitting a scarf, something she hadn't done in 10 years, when Julian came in, holding a small pot of flowers. "White daisies," he said, "the ones you used to call simple but strong." Eleanor said nothing. She just put the pot on the windowsill. "Thank you." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She went out onto the porch where Julian lay on a wooden chair, looking up at the sky. "Are you scared?" she asked. Julian sat up. "Yes." "For what?" "Because I know you could leave at any moment, and I can't blame you." Eleanor sat down beside her. Her hand touched her belly, now slightly rounded. "There are things that can't be forgiven," she said, "but can be understood, and can live with." Julian turned. "Are you talking about me or the baby?" "Both." The next day, Eleanor took Julian to Matthew's grave. They stood in silence for a long time before the headstone. Julian placed a sprig of lavender. No prayer, no apology, just bowed his head. "Your son will never know who you are," Eleanor said, "but this baby, he will know who his father is. And I have to be right about that." Julian nodded. "I will do anything, even if you never forgive me." Eleanor looked at him. Then she repeated softly, "Not forgiveness, but living together." In the weeks that followed, the house began to change. Linda came more often, helping prepare the nursery. Charles sent a handwritten letter, short but warm. "Forgiveness is not wiping away, it is allowing something new to be born." Eleanor kept the letter in a drawer just below Matthew's diary. One morning, Julian was sawing a dead branch when Eleanor came out onto the porch, holding a photograph. It was a picture of Thomas holding Matthew as a newborn. They were both smiling, radiant and at peace. "Are you ready to be that kind of father?" Eleanor asked. Julian looked at the photo, then at Eleanor. I will never be like him, but I will try." Eleanor smiled. For the first time, there was no bitterness in the smile. Neither of them used the word forgive again, because both understand what needs to be kept is the faith in tomorrow, not the purity of yesterday. I have lived more than 60 years, long enough to see spring return after the longest winters, long enough to lose people I love, and love people I never expected. If someone were to ask me, what keeps you from falling, I would not answer with a flowery answer. I would simply say, I did not choose to get up. I just kept breathing. There was a time when I thought the greatest pain in my life was losing my son. Matthew, the boy with deep eyes like his father, said he would take me to Japan when he graduated. He never came back. An accident. A phone call in the middle of the night. I lived the next 10 years like a shadow. Then Julian came. He came with eyes as deep as Matthew's, and I hated myself for noticing. I only hired him to do the gardening, but is life ever just I did not intend to love. He did not intend to apologize, but love and truth come when we are not ready. When I found out you were the one who took my son away, I thought I would die again. But the strange thing is I did not die. I lived, and I saw in that sin there was another seed, a new life growing inside me. I got pregnant at 60. Don't ask me how. A woman's body sometimes goes against reason. People call me crazy. I don't deny it. Crazy is when you still believe in the light, even though your heart has exploded many times in the darkness. Julian did not leave again. You stayed, not as a lover, not to make amends. You stayed as someone who wanted to start from where you left off. I do not forgive, but I let you live with me, because I understand forgiveness is not a gift for others. It is a way for yourself to move on. Now I write these lines in the room that used to be Matthew's. On the small bed, a living being sleeps, a small hand holding my finger as if not wanting to let go. The boy does not know about the past. No need to know. All he needs to know is that his mother was strong, and his father learned to love from mistakes. I am not a perfect woman, but I lived, I loved, I lost, and I started again. If you have ever lost, loved the wrong person, fallen because of the past, remember, there is nothing worse than refusing the chance to live on, even if you have to live with a scar. Because having scars is how the heart remembers what was important. Thank you for taking the time to listen to Eleanor's story, a woman who lived, loved, hurt, and forgave. If this story touches your heart, then perhaps, deep down, we all carry our own scars, and are all learning to move on, even if it is with tired feet. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening, not only with your ears, but with your heart. See you in the next stories, where things that seem impossible can still happen. Team Daily Unexpected Stories.